Hi everyone and welcome to another painting tutorial from Promethean Paints. Today we're going to be painting the new Ctan shard of the Nightbringer from Warhammer 40,000. I've done say a minor conversion to him, just altered the model ever so slightly that differs from the main version that you can build. So I have done him in some sub-assemblies, so I've built him as a whole there. I've just not attached any of the little scarabs. So I've attached all the little bits to sort of make him be able to sit on the base, and all the scarabs I've attached like that. But actually when I was painting this I decided that I wanted to do something a little bit different. I didn't want the scarabs to be coming off the main body, but how I paint the scarabs a bit later, you can still apply those same principles a bit later on. So we're not actually using the airbrush today. This is all going to be brushwork. We're going to be doing some glazing to get our nice gradient effects going from purple to green. But the first main step we need to do is base coat all of his big cape, all on his cloak and clothing. And for that we're going to be using AK Dragon Blood, which is a very nice rich deep sort of violet purple colour. So yeah, paint the entire cape area with this Dragon Blood. And that's all the way from the very top to the very bottom. Even where we're transitioning into green, we want the base coat to be this Dragon Blood colour. You can see I've skipped a little bit of head because you don't want to see me base coating a miniature. So this is all now base coated in that Dragon Blood, lovely rich deep colour. Only needed one coat. Now we're going to start our glazing, and for this we're using AK Greenskin Punch, which is a really nice dark green, but it's got a really nice vibrancy to it. So the first stage is I'm using a nice big old brush, and it's a couple of drops of paint on the palette and then lots of brushes of water. It's probably 80-20 mix water to paint, so lots and lots of water. And what we're doing here is we're creating what we call the glaze, which is even thinner than a wash, and so you want a lot more water than paint. And at first I put big splotches into the sort of about 3/4 of the way down his clothes where we want it to be green, then angling the brush towards the tips. This is where we want the most green, so we're going from that dark purple to a bright green. So in order to do that you need to be dragging that paint towards where you want it to be most green, because where the most paint is left is where you release your brush. Then to get transition from that green back up into that purple colour is I just add some water onto the brush, wipe most of it off, and then drag the paint upwards towards the purple colour so that we get a transition from the purple down to the green. And I just work my way around the model, so all the places that you want to be green, you do this glazing effect to going from that purple down into the green. And with this colour I probably do this process 2 to 3 times. I think it's 3 times, and you just apply that green further down. So at first you're about halfway to 3/4 of the way down, and then it's 1/4 of the way down, then a little bit less than that, and a little bit less than that, until you get a nice gradiented transition from the purple down all the way through to an almost pure greenskin punch at the bottom. So with glazing it's better to have more water than there is paint, because you can always apply more and more coats. You just got to make sure where that paint's pooling, you try and smooth it out so you don't get big clumps of it, especially on those transition areas. This is a really good model to practice the glazing, because there's some nice smooth areas where you can get really good transitions. And just don't forget to do this on the tips of the sort of tassels at the very base there of the tassels, and there's a little bit in the center just above it, just below his mouth in the neck area, which can be highlighted as well, which can bring some emphasis to his face. So as you can see, I've done this glazing a few times now, trying to get it. The paint needs to be dry between each step, obviously, and then we've got a nice transition now. Look at that, between the purple down into the green. It's really blended quite well, and we've almost reached full opacity at the very tips that we want to have the most green. So we're now ready that we can now intensify that green by going a step up. If you see that there's areas that you want to just blend in a little bit more, then just use the same principles, but just start again at the top like I am there, and just make sure you're still pulling that paint down towards where you want it to be left off, so that you get a little bit more intensity. You won't know how much of this you need to do until it starts drying, and drying back and losing some of that shine that it's got from the water. And there you can see the area just around the neck where we want it to be a little bit glowy green. And the Nightbringer. So now we're going to jump up, and we're going to be using AK Emerald Green, which is a slightly jade type green. It's got a little bit of blue in there, but it's very, very intense. So all I've done is I've put a couple of drops pretty much into the pool that I had left of the Greenskin green, and again added loads of water to the mix. So we've got another sort of 80-20 mix of this colour, another glaze. With this now I've moved to a smaller brush. I want a bit more control, and I'm doing exactly the same principle we just did with the Greenskin colour, but now we're using this brighter colour and a lot further down the model. So now I'm glazing this paint from quite near the tip right down towards the tip. It's really where you want the very tip. Obviously we've got that glowing effect, so along his clothing you've got all of the sort of sharp edges, the sort of pixelated cloak that he's wearing. So I'm coming down from that and glazing towards the bottom, so the most paint is left at the very tips, but also leaving a little bit of paint on those areas where I know I want a little bit of a glowing effect to be. So it doesn't matter that sometimes it's a bit more intense halfway up and very intense at the bottom. This is all personal preference of where you want your most intense green to be. But as I said, it's the same principle with this glaze, where we're pushing the paint towards the edges where we want it to be most brightest, and down away from where we had the transitions from the purple to the dark green. So you just want to make sure you leave some of that dark green in place and glazing down towards the bottom. Again, a few coats of this will be needed, so give it a good 10-15 minutes in between each coat, and then do it again, but working your way down the model, so that you get those transitions. It's a little bit of trial and error. If you find a transition hasn't worked, then sometimes you have to just go back, just reintroduce some of those darker areas, and then reintroduce it back into the brighter areas. Once you're happy that you've got your opacity now with this emerald green, where you've added a few coats of this, so we're now transitioning from the dark green to this bluish green. We then introduce another colour, which would be AK deep green. The recording went a little bit funny when doing this, and so not a lot of it is captured. But it was exactly the same principle. So with the deep green glazing, you go from, it's 80-20 mix again, so lots of water to the paint, and we introduce this even further down. So we go from the emerald green now into the bright green. So this deep green colour only covers maybe a centimetre at the bottom of each of his cloaks and the tassels, and just a tiny little bit around his neck area. But it's the same principles, a few layers of this to introduce a nice bright green, and then we get that transition from the purple to down into the dark green, into that emerald green, and then into this bright deep green. There you can see on the palette where I've got that deep green glaze, and as I said, it was exactly the same principles that we were doing it. So yeah, sorry that that piece of footage wasn't captured, but it was the same principles. There's no tricks there. It was just done just sadly off camera. So now what we want to do is I want to do some edge highlighting now, and this part does take a little bit of time. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm edge highlighting with the deep green from AK all of the areas where you can see the transition from that sort of emerald green down into the deep green. So I'm leaving a little bit of the black dark green and definitely the purple as it is. I'm not edge highlighting that with this color, and I'm just going to be edge highlighting you at the bottom and maybe 1.5 centimeters, 2 centimeters up. It's basically where you've got that green transition starting. Leave it a little bit and then add your green highlights. You'll see I'll pretty much show you everything that I'm highlighting here, and then we'll do a little review afterwards. But it is pretty much all of the definitely the bottom, and then we move up towards the transition from the black green, the dark green, up into the purple. Some of those transition areas as well, you'll notice I'm adding little lines, not all straight lines, little areas where I'm sort of dotting the paint up towards the highlights, remembering to highlight inside some of those pixelated areas as well. So just make sure you're just doing a full edge highlight where you want it to be showing that it's really green. can see with the little deep green highlights around this part around his neck, it really starts to glow now. You'll notice again, even on the tassels and at the edges of his, where you're adding this green edge highlight, you can see here it really starts to add that glowing effect. And you can see I've only done edge highlights up towards really where that emerald color starts to show through, then down to the tips, but it really makes that cloak look like a bluish green color. We're now going to do another edge highlight, and this is with AK Frog Green, which is sort of moot green if you were using the Citadel range. And this edge highlight is even smaller now, so this is really down towards the tips of the tassely areas where you want it to be really green. So covering probably about 20-30% of the edge highlight that we've originally done. Just remember to edge highlight any of those inside areas, inside those pixelated areas, and obviously a little bit further up where there's a little bit more green. But this is really only for the areas you really want to be intense green and really, really bright, that can take the fluorescent glowing effects a little bit later. And once that's done, we're going to do our final edge highlight, but this is really being done so that we can get our fluorescent effects going. So with that, we're going to be using a white hidden behind him there. This is AK Intense White that I use. And with this, and I'm only going to be applying this in very small areas, even less so. With that frog green, I'm probably only going to be covering like maybe 10% of what we've just covered with that frog green color. So this is only where you want to have your fluorescence really glowing through. So just work your way around the very tips really of his clothes, a little dot maybe in that central point under his mouth that we've been highlighting, and just at the end of the sort of tassely parts, the flowing areas around his cape. And once that white is dry, we're then going to grab some AK Fluorescent Green and just paint over the white that we've just applied and a little bit the other side of it as well. So the sort of the fluorescent green transitions down from that sort of the frog green that we had into the pure white green. This is a little bit like applying a contrast paint. You've got to apply this quite thick to cover that white. So it does take a little bit of time. Obviously not too thick, but you'll find if you do it too thin, the white shows through and it doesn't really have that much of an effect. And then the final stage that I do on this, just to really intensify, is add a little bit of AK fluorescent yellow to the tips. So only in selected areas, I just grab a little bit of the fluorescent yellow and just apply it into the areas where I want to be most bright. The fluorescent yellow really intensifies the green effect, but that is optional. And with that, that's the sort of cloak done. We're now going to be moving on to his to highlight the sort of the reddish pink of his cape. And for that, I've made a 50-50 mix of AK Magenta and that AK Dragon Blood. And with this 50-50 mix, we're just going to be layering up to increase the sort of intensity of that reddish purple pink of his cape. So just work yourself around the model. Obviously this is to be used as a full edge highlight and to paint over all of the raised areas. You could dry brush this on, but you may just get a little bit of dusty kind of after effect with it. But with a brush you get a little bit more control. It's pretty much filling about 60-70% of the area, leaving only a small bit in that dark colour. And obviously you want to leave some of the dark area where you've got those transitions into green, so just take care of how far down you pull your highlight colour down into those green areas. Then what I do is, in that 50-50 mix, I just add a bit more of the magenta. So now we've probably got about a 70 or 80 to 30 to 20 mix as more magenta has been added in. We also add a dot of water in there as well, just to thin it down. And again, this is a sort of full edge highlight, and now we're only painting those raised areas that we want to be brighter. There's quite a lot on this model, the sort of raised ridges and good areas of definition. So make sure you grab all of those and just paint this into the areas where you want it to be most bright. If you find the colours too intense, you may have added a bit too much magenta, or just add a bit more water, so you just thin that down, and just remember to get some of that excess paint off of the brush before you apply it. Okay, that's obviously one of the longest steps, but the more and more you add, the more intense that highlight becomes. Now we're gonna go a little bit crazy, and we're gonna do a 50-50 mix now of Magenta and Citadel Flayed One Flesh. So what we're doing is we're creating a highlight, but what we're doing is we're bleaching out the sort of pink purpleness and showing that the sort of the cloth is stretched almost down to no pigment at all within the cloth. So using instead of using white, which could be too garish, using a very pale sort of flesh tone keeps that pinky purple colour, but also adds that sort of washed out faded look. So what I'm doing here now is I'm just applying this as almost a spot highlight on the areas that I really want to stand out. So the areas around his face. The sort of, as you're looking at this straight on, it's those ridges that are really sharp, and that you want to add your highlight to. It's personal preference. I've not added too much of a highlight here, because if there's too much of a highlight, then it's not a highlight at all. So just pick out those areas that you want to do. If you wanted to do a full edge highlight, what I would do is not add as much Flayed One Flesh, maybe do a 70-30 in favour of your Magenta, and then work yourself down. But I wanted there to be big dark areas in between this model. So we've got really bright green, and then very dark, and then very bright sort of pinkish magenta, to have good contrast. And so it really highlights your transitions if you do that, from very bright and then an alternative colour very bright with nice darkness in the middle. Right, and that's obviously a big bulk of the model done. We're now just going to paint his body, and with that what I'm doing is I've just made a little mix. I've used 50-50 mix here with AK Gunmetal and AK Tenebrous Grey, and made that mix onto the wet palette, and I'm just painting over the entire model with that 50-50 mix. Sorry, not the entire model, obviously. Here's the areas that we want to be metal with that mix. We do the layering. So the first highlight layer is done with just pure AK gunmetal, and this is applied to all of those raised areas, a little bit like you would paint skin. You'd paint the raised areas, you'd paint the raised bits of muscle, you'd paint the sort of knuckle areas and that. So we're just same principles, but we're just using metallic colours. So this first layer is done with the pure AK gunmetal. On his scythe, I obviously do edge highlighting on the scythe and pick out the areas that I want to be brighter, little scrapes and scratches. And on his face, picking it out. It's quite good definition on his face, a little bit on his chin, his nose, and his sort of metallic eyebrows. And then our final highlight, I'm going to be using AK Natural Steel, which is a very, very bright silver, and doing, again, another layer up, which is just going to be our sort of final edge highlights, just picking out those areas you really, really want to be bright. So on his scythe, tips of his sort of knuckles, on his nose, and just on his sort of kneecap, any that really would catch the light, just pick those out. Then we get really nice transition from that dark metal colour we applied up to that really, really bright silver. The next step is an optional one, but it just added some variations to his metallic skin. So I'm using AK metallic blue, and I'm just applying this very subtly in some areas where I just thought that some of that, where the light is reflecting off it, there might be a little bit of blue hints into it. You could use a blue wash, but I saw this paint from AK and I thought I'd give it a go, and it actually gives a nice subtle effect. So I just apply this metallic blue in a few areas, just to show some of that blue showing through. And then, because I wanted a little bit of green, I grabbed some Citadel Biel green, which is the shade paint, and very carefully, using the small brush, I just sort of almost glaze this onto mainly his scythe, just to give some green towards that sort of base area, and a little bit around some shadow areas, just to show that there's a little bit of green onto this model. Very, very subtle, but when you're looking at the model, you can actually see those colours on it, and it just has a little bit of variation, breaks up some of the mundane that you can get with the silver. And nearly there with the main body of the guy. We're just going to apply some glowing effects to his mouth and eyes, and basically all we're going to do is same principles actually that we used on his clothing, but we're just going to be doing it over smaller areas. So any areas that you want to have on his face glowing green, just base coat with Greenskin punch, then add a little bit of deep green into those areas, just where you want it to be, the glow to be. Then, like for his eyes, a couple of dots of white, and then paint over those with the fluorescent green colour. With the eyes, I paint the entire socket the dark green. Then the eye itself, you paint green, then with a little couple of dots of white, and then paint over the white with the fluorescent colour, and you get a nice, quite very quick green glowing effect. And that's the main guy done. Relatively quick for a big model. The most time's taken really doing the edge highlighting. I found it took quite a bit of time. Now for the base, like I mentioned, I did mine a little bit differently. I actually cut up the scarabs so I could have them walking along the base, and found that if I used some 3D printed bits from Deadly Print Studios and Gamer Grass, I could actually get him so that his cape and that would be glued to those the plinths that are stood up. I also got from Deadly Print Studios, you can buy the full prints, all the STLs. I've got a dead Intercessor and a dead Cadian Soldier as well, which I've applied to the base. And all I've done is I've used my dirt mix that I've got, which is just brick dust and stuff bought off of eBay, painted that in the Tenebrous grey, and then covered the whole thing with the sort of base area with the dirty down rust. Just painted that. How I applied that, you can see in some of my other videos how to apply the dirty down rust, and that's covered in some others. And then what I'm showing in this section is I've just got a palette full of colours, and I'm just painting these models up based on just basic things, because I'm going to go over these with washes and some dried blood and stuff, so they don't have to be absolutely perfect. I don't want these to stand out too much. I want the model to stand out, and the little scarabs on the base. These are just little bits of periphery on the base, just to add a little bit of storytelling really. So there's some blues that I've used from AK and Army Painted, and some greens and some silvers. The little mushrooms that are from Gamer Grass are just done using magenta colours that we've used, and some fluorescent colours. I show all the colours as we go through. I won't go into too much detail. I've done this. The green glowing effect on the scarabs, quite a neat little trick to do, where you use pure white to paint the bit you want to be really bright, and then just water that white down and just flush it into the areas where you want a little bit of afterglow to be, and then paint that pure white with fluorescent green, and where you want that after effect to be, just use the striking scorpion contrast paint over to that white, and you'll get a really nice quick and easy green glowing effect on your little scarabs. So yeah, this part I won't commentate too much on it. Some people don't want to know how I do the basing because they've got your own ways to do it, but there might be a few little tips and tricks that you see along here that might be helpful. Once this is all finished, I just dry brush with a sort of, I use AK light earth, but any sort of light brownish dirty colour will do. You'll notice that I do washes over these guys with some watered down Ratling Grime. So Ratling Grime for me is like a contrast version of Agrax Earthshade. So if you water down Ratling Grime, you get a nice wash with it. And then I paint the rim in a matte black. yeah, so there he is. You can see where I've glued him onto it. He's pretty secure with using some super glue. So yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. It's pretty quick and easy, I found, painting this guy. I thought it was going to be a lot complicated not using the airbrush. Obviously you could use the airbrush to get those transitions, but a lot of people have been asking how we would glaze those in, and this is an ideal model to show some glazing effects. So yeah, hope you've enjoyed the tutorial. Like, comment, subscribe as you always usually do. Your support is really appreciated, and happy painting, my fellow painters.